The air reeked of cordite and damp coral. Private Kenji Nakamura pressed his cheek against the jagged edge of his trench on Saipan, June 27, 1944. The coral bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. Hunger gnawed deeper than pain. His hands clutched the wooden stock of his Type 99 Arisaka, its 5-round internal magazine already half empty. The weapon had served his regiment faithfully for months, but against the relentless clatter of American rifles, its bolt-action rhythm felt like an antique clock ticking toward midnight. For days, he and the other remnants of the Imperial Japanese 43rd Infantry Regiment had survived on handfuls of half-rotted rice, sometimes scavenged from fallen comrades. His officers still spoke of honor, of dying in banzai charges rather than bowing to the barbarian. But Kenji could see the truth. The island was already lost. American artillery had reduced ridgelines to dust, and now something worse crept toward their caves. The guttural roar of M4 Sherman tanks converted into flamethrower models, POWs, belching fire hundreds of feet into the earth itself. He imagined the Americans fighting with the same scarcity as his own unit. Surely their rifles would jam, their rations thin, their water fouled by the tropical heat. Instead, the fields around Sharan Kanoa had filled with equipment as plentiful as sugarcane. Every GI seemed to carry a M1 Garand, that semi-automatic wonder weighing 9.5 pounds, spitting 8 rounds as fast as a man could squeeze the trigger. Nakamura's comrades called it the self-loading rifle, said it was unfair, too advanced for ordinary soldiers. But here it was, standard issue, hundreds of thousands shipped straight from American factories. The roar grew closer. Smoke and heat washed into his trench, driving him out into daylight he had prayed never to see again. He expected the butt of a rifle, the slash of a bayonet. Instead, he saw a young American Marine, helmet cocked back, dust clinging to his sweat-streaked face. The man chewed something between his teeth, bread and meat, juices running down his chin. In one hand he gripped his Garand, and in the other, so casual it seemed like a dream, he lifted a glass bottle. It hissed when the cap twisted off. The label, bright against the grime of war, read, Coca-Cola. Kenji froze. For months he had been told Americans were devils, destroyers, less than human. Yet here one stood, drinking something cold and sweet, while the battlefield still smoldered. Hunger twisted in Kenji's gut, but deeper than hunger was disbelief. Could an army at war really have enough to waste sugar on drinks? The Marine raised the bottle to his lips, the fizz audible even over distant gunfire. For Kenji, it was not a weapon that marked his defeat, but a sound. The impossible luxury of a cold drink in a place where water itself was rationed. Sergeant William Red Callahan had stopped counting the days on Saipan. The heat was relentless. The coral tore his boots to ribbons, and the stench of death clung to everything. But what stuck with him wasn't the battlefield. It was the taste of Coca-Cola. He tilted the bottle high, savoring the fizz that bit the back of his throat, watching the bubbles climb the brown glass like they had in every bar back home in Chicago. What the Marines called the pause that refreshes wasn't just marketing, it was logistics turned into morale. Callahan knew it was no accident. The Coca-Cola Company, under orders from Washington, had built 64 bottling plants overseas, each designed to put a 5-cent Coke into the hands of every GI, no matter how far from home. By war's end, they'd ship more than 5 billion bottles across oceans patrolled by submarines and skies once dominated by Japanese Zeros. To Callahan, each sip tasted like victory, not because it was sweet, but because it was inevitable. The irony was that it wasn't just GIS who noticed. Prisoners shuffled past under guard, their uniforms tattered, eyes hollow from hunger. Callahan caught one staring, not at his rifle, not at the pack of grenades at his hip, but at the Coke bottle in his hand. He remembered what the Navy boys had said. The Japanese believed capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation. Instead, they would see Americans eating hamburgers grilled on field stoves, white bread stacked like it grew on trees, steaming coffee poured into tin mugs. Later that night, Callahan joined his squad at a makeshift chow line. The menu read like a diner back home: ground beef patties, onions fried in lard, and thick slices of bread. Hamburgers in a war zone, an impossible luxury to the enemy, routine for the Americans. He thought of the stories from the front: Japanese rations dwindling to sweet potatoes and scraps of rice, men so weak they could barely lift their rifles. Yet here, Marines joked over burgers while transport ships offshore unloaded crates of both ammunition and Coca-Cola with equal speed. The numbers were as staggering as the taste was familiar. Back home, factories poured out rifles, shells, and rations by the millions. On Saipan alone, Callahan knew the U.S. had landed more than 67,000 troops supported by naval guns that could flatten an entire hillside with a single broadside. But it was the little things, the hamburger smell drifting through a camp, the hiss of a Coke bottle opening, that told the true story of American war-making. As he wiped grease from his hands, Callahan caught sight of another line of prisoners shuffling past. Their eyes were not on the machine guns that guarded them, but on the hamburgers sizzling on cast-iron skillets. He realized then, for them, the war wasn't just lost in the trenches. It was lost at the mess table. The sound came first as a whisper through the jungle heat, notes drifting on the wind, alien yet strangely joyful. Kenji Nakamura, now disarmed and herded toward a makeshift stockade on Saipan, paused when he heard it clearly. Brass horns, drums, and a woman's voice singing in a tongue he barely understood. It wasn't martial music. It wasn't the shrill bugle calls he knew. It was swing, bright and irresistible, carried over a loudspeaker set up by the Americans. This was no accident of leisure. It was the Armed Forces Radio Service, created in 1942 to beam news and music to GIs across the globe. With transmitters set up from Hawaii to Guadalcanal, AFRS carried Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, and Count Basie into the foxholes and onto the beaches. By 1945, its programs reached every American unit in the Pacific. What Kenji heard that day on Saipan was the soundtrack of a democracy confident enough to share joy even in war. But it wasn't just jazz that poured from the speakers. Leaflets fluttered down from aircraft, printed with promises in Japanese script. Lay down your arms. You will receive food, clean clothing, medical care, and cigarettes. Kenji picked one up, tracing the characters with trembling fingers. Every officer had told him these were lies. Yet he had already seen the evidence: hamburgers sizzling, Coke bottles open, prisoners treated with bandages instead of bullets. The psychological warfare was relentless. Loudspeakers mounted on jeeps rolled forward, broadcasting in Japanese, sometimes using voices of captured soldiers to call to their comrades, still hiding in caves. Kenji could imagine the terror this would strike in men who still clung to their rifles. To hear one's own language not as an enemy threat but as an invitation to surrender, This was warfare of a kind the Imperial Army had never prepared them for. And there was the music. To American ears, swing was background noise, a reminder of dances back home and radio evenings in the kitchen. To Kenji, it was disorienting proof that the enemy had so much abundance, he could afford to waste energy on pleasure. While Japanese radios sputtered static and silence, the Americans flooded the battlefield with melody. That night, under guard, Kenji lay on the ground listening. The guns had fallen quiet for the moment. From the loudspeakers drifted another tune, this one softer, a crooning voice over gentle chords. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The enemy was strong enough to sing. The first thing Kenji smelled inside the stockade was food, not the thin gruel of his regiment's final days, but something rich, meat fat sizzling, bread toasting. He expected interrogation, beatings, starvation. Instead, he was handed a tin plate by an American private. On it sat a hamburger patty, bread soft and white as snow, and a steaming cup of coffee. This was not generosity. It was policy. By 1943, the U.S. War Department had ordered that all POWs be fed adequate calories, and by 1944, Japanese prisoners in America were even given rice, soy sauce, and dried fish to maintain health. At Saipan, collection points worked under the Geneva Convention standard: disarm, register, treat the wounded, and feed. The menu that stunned Kenji was routine for the Americans, but to him, it was a revelation. The contrast could not have been sharper. Japanese field rations had dwindled to ounces of rice and occasional sweet potatoes. Starvation had become a strategy. Better to die lean than to surrender full. Yet here, in the very shadow of defeat, the enemy handed out hot meals. Even the cigarettes were distributed, American brands in neat packs, lit by guards who chuckled as they struck matches. The statistics made the difference undeniable. A U.S. soldier consumed on average 3,600 calories a day, supplied by a logistical system that landed millions of tons of rations across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, often fell below 2,000 calories, weakening bodies before battle even began. Where Kenji's comrades rationed a single canteen among 10 men, the Americans landed crates of Coca-Cola on beaches still echoing with gunfire. Kenji ate slowly, each bite both comfort and humiliation. He remembered his officer's words: better to fall on your own bayonet than to taste enemy food. Yet his hunger overruled doctrine. The bread was soft beyond belief, the meat salty and savory, the coffee bitter but strong. He swallowed shame with every mouthful, and with it came a new clarity. The Empire's promises had been hollow. The Americans did not torture. They overwhelmed. Around him, other prisoners ate as if in a trance, their faces lit by the glow of lanterns and campfires. Some wept. Others laughed nervously, unsure if this abundance was a trick. Kenji simply chewed and stared at the guards. They leaned on their gurans, eating their own meals with casual indifference, as if this war were merely a long inconvenience. The revelation was not that the Americans could kill. That had been obvious for months. The revelation was that they could feed even their enemies, and never run out. The harbor at Saipan groaned with metal. From dawn until dusk, Liberty ships lined the reef, their cranes swinging like metronomes, unloading a tide of crates, vehicles, and barrels. To the prisoners penned nearby, it looked less like a military campaign and more like a factory floor transplanted onto the Pacific. Kenji Nakamura had never seen such abundance. Each day brought more proof. A single Liberty ship could disgorge thousands of tons of cargo, ammunition stacked in neat pyramids, crates of rations, drums of gasoline, and, astonishingly, cases of Coca-Cola unloaded beside artillery shells. To Americans, the sight was routine, just another day's work in the Pacific. To Japanese prisoners, it was surreal. They knew that in their homeland, shipyards struggled to replace even a handful of transports lost to American submarines. The statistics told the true story. The United States built 2,710 Liberty ships, each averaging 39 days from keel to launch. In 1943 alone, American yards produced 3 ships per day, an impossible rhythm for any nation, but one driven by democratic industry. By contrast, Japan's merchant fleet bled faster than it could be replenished, each sunk freighter eroding the empire's lifeline to oil and food. Kenji had fought believing Japan still had a chance. Now he saw how foolish that belief had been. If America could land hamburgers and soda alongside howitzers, then Japan's empire had already collapsed under the weight of arithmetic. Sergeant William Red Callahan knew the numbers without needing to read them. He watched the harbor churn with activity and thought of Chicago's stockyards, where trains once brought endless cattle for slaughter. The same principle now applied to war. America had turned conflict into industry. 96,318 aircraft had rolled off U.S. assembly lines in 1944 alone, more than 3 times Japan's entire output that year. The enemy couldn't compete. POWs assigned to labor details unloaded crates under guard, their faces pale with disbelief. Some paused when a shipment of Coca-Cola rolled down the gangplank, bottles clinking together like church bells. To them, the message was unmistakable. The Americans had so much they could flood the battlefield with luxuries even while fighting raged a few miles away. As dusk fell, the harbor lights blinked on, illuminating a scene of perpetual motion. Cranes swung, trucks rumbled, forklifts groaned. Kenji sat behind the wire and stared, trying to measure what he saw. It wasn't an army at war. It was a nation in motion, a river of steel and glass that would never run dry. The sky opened on Okinawa in May 1945, and the rain never seemed to stop. Torrents turned the island's limestone ridges into rivers of mud. The men of the U.S. 10th Army trudged forward through fields that sucked at their boots, each step a battle against water as much as against the enemy. For Aya Takahashi, a conscripted nurse working near Shuri, the downpour was both blessing and curse. It cloaked retreat, but it also drowned the wounded in their own trenches. From her station, she could hear the thunder of American artillery echoing across the island. The guns were relentless, their shells hissing through sheets of rain before bursting in showers of flame and stone. Behind them came the tanks, M4 Shermans, some converted into POWs, one flamethrower models, their nozzles spraying fire into cave mouths that glowed like furnaces against the storm. The earth itself seemed to boil. The Japanese 32nd Army fought with courage, but their resources were gone. Ammunition ran low, food scarcer still. Soldiers huddled in caves, coughing in the smoke, eating handfuls of raw sweet potato when they could find it. Against them stood an American force supplied without end. Crates of rations and shells rolled ashore even as rain pounded the beaches. Liberty ships kept coming. The impossible truth was that the weather hurt the Japanese far more than the Americans. Casualties mounted with a brutality that defied belief. By June's end, more than 77,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead, along with tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. American losses were grievous, 12,500 killed, but their replacements, equipment, and supplies never ceased. The balance sheet was merciless, and everyone on the island felt it. Aya noticed the difference in small details. American prisoners of rain huddled under ponchos, sipping hot coffee from tin mugs. Japanese soldiers under her care lay shivering without blankets. When prisoners were captured and marched past her station, she saw something astonishing. Despite the storm, they were given dry clothing, cigarettes, and even food. Some were guided toward cages where the sound of a radio drifted. A jazz melody played through the rain. For Aya, that sound was almost more shocking than the flames. Music in a battlefield? It seemed like blasphemy, yet there it was. Horns and drums competing with thunder. The Americans not only brought fire and steel, they brought culture, as if even the storm could not interrupt their abundance. She looked at the flooded fields, at the bedraggled defenders clutching rusted rifles, and understood what others would only admit later. The war was already over. The rain did not decide the battle, but it revealed the truth. Against American industry, even the weather could not shift the tide. Snowflakes clung to the barbed wire at Camp McCoy, drifting softly onto a landscape that felt more foreign to Kenji Nakamura than any battlefield. Only months earlier, he had crouched in Saipan's coral trenches, waiting for death. Now he found himself in Wisconsin, the largest Japanese POW camp in the United States, where more than 2,700 of his countrymen were held. He shivered in a borrowed coat, marveling that even captivity here was warmer than freedom in the Pacific had been. The first shock was the food. At roll call, guards marched the prisoners into a mess hall that smelled of boiled rice, soy sauce, and dried fish. It was not American chow, but Japanese cuisine, reconstructed by camp kitchens under War Department orders from 1943 that mandated ethnic menus whenever possible. This was no act of kindness. It was policy, rooted in the Geneva Convention. Still, the prisoners could hardly believe it. Rice in America for Japanese prisoners? It was as if the world had turned upside down. Yet the contrast lingered at every turn. The guards themselves sat at separate tables eating hamburgers, white bread, and thick coffee, their meals piled high with calories. The prisoners received enough to survive, better than they had known on Okinawa, but the Americans seemed to eat without limits. Kenji studied their trays with equal parts envy and awe. Beyond food, the camp revealed another surprise: dignity. Medical staff treated infections, set bones, and filled cavities. Religious services were permitted. Newspapers circulated, including the camp's own publication, The Real McCoy, which printed the surrender announcement on August 14, 1945, in headlines both prisoners and guards could read. For men conditioned to expect cruelty, these routines became a steady erosion of old beliefs. What shocked Kenji most was not brutality, but indifference. The guards were not cruel because they did not need to be. America's victory was so total that it required no demonstration of dominance. The POWs were simply another responsibility in a system vast enough to house, feed, and monitor millions without faltering. Snow fell harder outside, muffling the camp in silence. Kenji stood in line for his ration, holding a tin bowl filled with rice and sukiyaki. He looked through the window at the guards laughing over hamburgers. It struck him with sudden clarity. If hamburgers were a casual meal here, how could Japan ever have believed it could starve America into submission? The war had been lost not in a single battle, but in every cafeteria, factory, and farm that kept this machine fed. It began with a crackle of static, then the warm swell of horns. At Camp McCoy, loudspeakers mounted in the recreation hall carried the sounds of America's heart. Benny Goodman swinging through a clarinet solo, Glenn Miller's orchestra thundering with brass. For the first time in his life, Kenji heard jazz in its native setting, not as a rumor, but as living sound. The broadcasts came from the Armed Forces Radio Service, established in 1942 to bring news and music to GIs overseas. By war's end, AFRS had become an empire of sound, transmitting programs to every corner of the globe. In the Pacific, radios had carried swing into foxholes. In America's POW camps, the same music now reached captured enemies, a constant reminder of the culture that fed the men who had defeated them. For the Americans, the music was background, a comfort from home. For the Japanese prisoners, it was disorienting. This was not the martial discipline they had been taught to expect from a great power. It was playful, improvisational, even joyful. It sounded like freedom itself, and to men raised in an empire of rigid command, the very idea was unsettling. Aya Takahashi, now in Japan after the surrender, experienced something similar. American bases in Tokyo and Yokohama hired local musicians to play for troops, jazz clubs springing to life almost overnight. What had been the soundtrack of defeat in Okinawa became, within a year, the soundtrack of survival. Bands of Japanese players copied the records they heard, learning riffs and melodies that became the foundation of a new cultural era. The technical miracle of AFRS was as impressive as its music. Portable transmitters, often no larger than a field crate, carried signals across islands and into occupation zones. Records were pressed and distributed by the millions, sometimes flown to forward bases within days of release in the United States. A single network, created to steady American morale, became the most powerful cultural broadcast system in history. Kenji listened each evening with the other prisoners, at first with suspicion, then with quiet wonder. He did not understand the lyrics, but he understood the rhythm. It pulsed with energy that no army could suppress. The guards tapped their feet, prisoners leaned against bunks, and for a moment the wire fence seemed to vanish. The irony was sharp. Japan had tried to break America with discipline and sacrifice. Instead, America had broken Japan with hamburgers, Coca-Cola, and jazz. As the last notes of a trumpet faded into static, Kenji realized the truth. This music was not a luxury. It was a weapon, one his country had never imagined. Kenji Nakamura had grown up in a land where every grain of rice was counted, where waste was seen as sin. In the camps, he saw the opposite. At Camp McCoy, after a meal, guards scraped plates heavy with uneaten food into barrels destined for disposal. Half a hamburger here, a crust of bread there, untouched coffee poured into the dirt. To Kenji, each morsel represented days of rations for a Japanese platoon. He stared at the scraps and felt something worse than hunger. He felt insignificance. The truth was plain. America produced more food than it knew what to do with. Its soldiers consumed 3,600 calories a day, and even then, mountains of food ended up discarded. In the Pacific, cases of Coca-Cola were stacked so high they became benches, soldiers sitting on crates of soda as casually as Japanese soldiers sat on rocks. It was the casualness that hurt most. For the Americans, abundance was not precious, it was normal. He remembered Okinawa, where men gnawed raw sweet potatoes, their bellies cramping, while officers assured them the empire still stood strong. He remembered Saipan, where his regiment fought on empty stomachs while American mess tents smoked with grilled beef. The contrast was unbearable. Japan's soldiers had fought with courage, but courage could not fill an empty stomach. Sergeant William Callahan, watching the POWs, noticed their eyes linger not on rifles or tanks, but on food. He understood instinctively that the war was over in their minds. It wasn't artillery that broke them. It was the sight of hamburgers thrown away, Coke bottles half drunk, bread left on trays. Waste became a weapon, as potent as any Garand. The statistics confirmed what Kenji felt. America's sugar production during the war was so vast that bottling Coca-Cola for soldiers required no rationing at home. Meanwhile, Japan struggled to ship enough rice to its garrisons, many cut off entirely by submarine warfare. In some Pacific outposts, soldiers starved before firing a shot. Kenji watched one evening as guards tossed uneaten food into a pit behind the mess. He thought of his younger brother, still somewhere in Manchuria, perhaps hungry, perhaps already gone. For a moment, he hated the Americans, not for cruelty, but for indifference. They had so much they could throw it away, and that truth was more devastating than any defeat on the battlefield. When the guards left, crows circled the pit, feeding on scraps of bread. Kenji turned away, the bitter taste of envy in his mouth. America had won the war with production so immense it bred waste, and to the prisoners, that waste was a daily reminder. Their empire had been doomed from the start. In the barracks one winter morning, an American officer chalked figures on a blackboard. He spoke in English, his words translated by a Japanese interpreter, but the numbers needed no translation. 96,318 American aircraft in 1944. 28,180 Japanese. The digits filled the board like rows of artillery shells. Kenji stared at them, his mind struggling to process the scale. The officer continued. 2,710 Liberty ships built by American yards, some launched in under 6 weeks, an average of 3 per day in 1943. Japan could not replace its losses. Submarines had already strangled its fleet. Then came the numbers of soldiers, millions mobilized, millions more still in reserve. Even after Okinawa, America's industrial heartland ran at full power, shipyards glowing through the night, aircraft factories humming like beehives. Kenji remembered the empty granaries back home, the hushed words of his mother when rice rations shrank. He remembered officers promising that spirit would outlast machines. Yet here were the machines. Their output measured not in dozens or hundreds, but in tens of thousands. The arithmetic was merciless. For every Zero fighter Japan built, America rolled out 4 Hellcats. For every Japanese soldier fed on sweet potatoes, an American soldier ate beef, bread, and drank Coca-Cola. The prisoners whispered among themselves after the lecture. Some refused to believe, insisting the Americans exaggerated. But Kenji had seen the harbors of Saipan, the endless ships, the cargo stacked higher than houses. He had seen hamburgers served in the shadow of flamethrowers. Now the numbers simply confirmed what his eyes already knew. Sergeant Callahan, overhearing the whispers, shook his head. He had grown up with numbers like these: assembly lines in Detroit, stockyards in Chicago, railroads that stretched without end. To him, the war's outcome had never been in doubt, but watching the prisoners, he realized the statistics were more powerful than any guard tower. They explained the unexplainable: why American soldiers could waste food, why Coke was drunk at the front, why jazz played even as shells fell. The officer closed the lecture with a simple sentence: "This is why you lost." He tapped the board with his chalk, dust falling like snow. Kenji bowed his head, no longer ashamed but resigned. Numbers had crushed Japan more thoroughly than bullets. That night, as he lay on his bunk, the chalkboard figures burned in his memory. 96,318 planes, 2,710 ships, 3 per day. Numbers too large to comprehend, yet undeniable. The math of defeat was final, and it was written not on battle maps, but on production charts. The war ended not with a final shout, but with silence. At Camp McCoy, prisoners listened as loudspeakers announced the Japanese surrender on August 14, 1945. Kenji Nakamura bowed his head, unsure whether to feel shame or relief. The guns had gone quiet, but captivity remained. He thought then that defeat would be the last chapter of his life. He was wrong. It was only the beginning. When he returned to Japan months later, he stepped into a homeland transformed. Cities lay in rubble, railways twisted, factories gutted by firebombs. Yet, amid the ruins, new sounds rose. From American bases in Tokyo and Yokohama came the steady hum of radios, the swing of jazz bands, the laughter of soldiers with bottles of Coca-Cola in hand. It felt like déjà vu. What he had first seen behind barbed wire in Wisconsin now played out on the streets of his own country. In October 1946, Coca-Cola opened a bottling plant in Okinawa, producing truckloads of soda for U.S. personnel. Japanese civilians, many working on bases, tasted the drink themselves, the fizz and sweetness a symbol of something larger than refreshment. Soon, Coke appeared in shops catering to locals, its logo bright against gray rubble. What had been the flavor of enemy power became a taste of recovery. Jazz followed the same path. American bases hired Japanese musicians to entertain GIs. At first, they mimicked Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington, copying notes from borrowed records. But in time, they added their own touches, and Japanese jazz clubs bloomed, their stages crowded, their audiences young and hungry for something new. Aya Takahashi, once a nurse on Okinawa, walked past one such club and felt the strange recognition of survival. Music that had once marked defeat now carried hope. Even hamburgers found their place. Base canteens served them daily, and soon stalls outside the gates began offering their own versions. To Japanese civilians still haunted by memories of ration lines, a hamburger was not just food. It was proof that the famine could be beaten, that abundance had returned. Kenji saw it all with weary eyes. He remembered staring at American guards eating hamburgers in the snow of Wisconsin, prisoners dreaming of food they thought they'd never taste again. Now he watched his own children eat them in Tokyo, laughing, their faces free of hunger. The symbols of his captivity had become the symbols of his family's survival. Years later, Kenji sat in a small cafe in Tokyo, the neon lights buzzing outside, a glass bottle of Coca-Cola sweating on the table before him. His hands trembled as he lifted it, not from age alone, but from memory. The hiss of the cap, the fizz of the bubbles, it carried him back to Saipan, to the moment he first saw an American Marine drink one as casually as water. He thought of the Empire's promises, of the officers who swore surrender meant torture, starvation, dishonor. None of it had been true. What he remembered instead was hamburgers offered freely, jazz echoing across the rain on Okinawa, cigarettes lit by guards who treated prisoners not as monsters, but as men. He remembered the waste pits at Camp McCoy, where scraps of bread and meat rotted unused, and how that waste had broken him more than bullets ever could. The numbers were impossible even now. America had produced in a single year more planes than Japan could in 5. It had launched 3 ships a day while Japan lost convoys faster than they could be built. It had supplied not just bullets and bombs, but luxuries. Coca-Cola by the billion, hamburgers in mess halls, jazz on every radio. Abundance itself had been the weapon, and it had worked. For Kenji, the memory carried both bitterness and gratitude. Bitterness, because he had fought and lost to a nation whose power dwarfed his own before the first shot was fired. Gratitude, because defeat had not brought annihilation. Instead, it had brought music, food, and, slowly, dignity. His country rebuilt itself, not with bayonets, but with bottles, burgers, and brass horns. He raised the Coke to his lips and took a sip. The sweetness lingered, mixed with salt from tears he did not try to hide. Around him, the cafe buzzed with young people, some listening to jazz records, others eating hamburgers from paper wrappers. They knew nothing of the trenches of Saipan or the rains of Okinawa. They only knew abundance. Kenji smiled faintly. The Empire had died, but life had returned. The war had ended not in the surrender ceremony on the USS Missouri, but in the quiet moments when prisoners realized the enemy had more food than they could ever eat, more music than they could silence, more industry than they could fathom. For him, the memory of defeat was inseparable from the hiss of a bottle, the smell of fried meat, and the sound of a saxophone in the rain.